Welcome back to Governance Matters. You know us. We dive deep into boardroom best practices and strategic leadership insights. This is the place where we help board members, executives, and governance professionals, elevate decision-making and all of that organizational impact. Well, today we're doing a deep dive on fair leadership processes.
Ooh, fair leadership.
And we have got an interesting mix of sources.
Will hail me.
We've got academic papers on leadership coaching. We even have some insights from, get this, a book about Napoleon.
Napoleon. What's he got to do with boardrooms?
Well, we'll get into that. We also have some corporate governance fact books.
The usual suspects.
Always helpful. And to round it out, we have a document that really gets into decision-making biases. Those pesky biases we all fall prey to.
Oh, I know those all too well. Can't live with them, can't live without them.
Exactly. But today's mission, what are we really trying to get at? How can we understand how implementing these fair processes can really boost team performance?
Yeah, how do we get everyone rowing in the same direction, right?
Exactly. And, speaking of rowing in the same direction, our first source, it's an article. It's called Fair Process, Striving for Justice in Family Business.
Family business, huh? That sounds pretty niche.
It does, but trust me, the principles here are relevant to any organization where you have those, those complex relationships, those high stakes.
So like every organization ever.
Pretty much. Now, the article really highlights, I think, a critical distinction between distributive justice, that's the who gets what, versus procedural justice. That's the how those decisions are made.
So it's not just about the outcome, it's about the journey.
Exactly. And in family businesses, you can imagine achieving that distributive justice, satisfying everyone. Pretty tricky.
Correct with that.
Right?
Yeah.
That's where fair process comes in.
So it's like leveling the playing field, making sure everyone feels heard.
Precisely. It shifts the focus from the what to the how. It's about making sure that decision-making process, the process itself, is fair.
Regardless of whether you get the outcome you wanted or not.
Exactly. And the article goes on to say that this can actually, this fair process can reduce conflict.
Really? So less arguing, more agreeing.
You got it. And you actually get more buy-in, even when the outcome isn't what everyone desired.
That's pretty powerful. I mean, if people feel like they were actually part of the process, they're more likely to accept the decision, even if it wasn't their, top choice.
100%. And the article actually lays out, get this, 5 specific criteria for a fair process.
All right, hit me with them.
Number 1, and this one's big, engagement. It's all about involving all relevant stakeholders, not just, the select few, the inner circle.
Makes sense. If you're going to be affected by a decision, you should at least have a seat at the table, right?
Absolutely. Then there's explanation, right? You have to explain yourself. It's about being transparent, communicating why we're making these decisions.
So no more smoke and mirrors in the boardroom.
Not if we can help it. And then we've got expectation clarity. This one's all about making sure everybody knows what happens after the decision is made. Roles, responsibilities, timelines.
Yeah, gotta get all those ducks in a row.
And then, of course, we can't forget communication and voice.
So it's about encouraging healthy debate, even if those views go against the grain.
Exactly. It's not about silencing dissent. It's about creating a space for it, as long as it's respectful.
Makes sense. You need all those perspectives to make a truly informed decision.
And finally, the foundation of it all, it's a culture of integrity. Everybody involved needs to act with honesty and integrity.
So basically, no backroom deals or shady maneuvering.
Okay. It's about creating a process that's actually unbiased, free from any kind of, manipulation. Now we see these principles in action, or rather a lack thereof, in the Interbrew case study. You remember Interbrew? They acquired Bass Brewers, but faced a lot of backlash.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They ran into a ton of regulatory hurdles, didn't they?
They sure did. And, some of that could have been avoided if they had focused more on stakeholder engagement from the start. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when you prioritize speed over process.
Speed over process, yeah. That's a recipe for disaster.
Now, let's look at an example where they did it right. The Leadership Group Coaching in Action source highlights a leadership coaching program that's a prime example of fair process in action. It's all about creating a space where people can speak their minds.
Because sometimes people hold back their true thoughts.
Exactly. And that can lead to some pretty bad decisions, right? You don't have all the information.
You're flying blind.
Exactly. And that can lead to resentment and ultimately poor decision-making. So I want you to think about your own organization for a second. Have you ever been part of a decision-making process that just felt unfair, where any of these 5 criteria could have helped?
Oh, I'm sure we've all been there. It's definitely something to reflect on. How can we make our own leadership processes fairer, more inclusive, where everyone feels like they have a voice and are respected?
Now, speaking of high-stakes decisions,
So,
let's talk about CEO succession.
Okay, let's talk about it. Boy, is that ever a high-stakes game. I mean, not just for the people involved, but for the entire organization. It's make or break time.
It really is. And the MasterCard CEO succession, that case study, it really offers a good example, I think, of how a thoughtful process can lead to a smooth transition.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. And what was interesting to me, MasterCard, they started planning years in advance.
Wow, they were thinking long-term.
Yeah, they weren't looking for a quick fix. They wanted a deliberate process, one where you could actually see, potential successors sort of rise up and grow into that role.
And probably weeding out the ones that weren't a good fit along the way.
Yeah, and they cast a wide net, too, making sure they weren't just looking at the usual suspects. They wanted diverse perspectives, different candidates.
That's smart. You don't want to get stuck in a rut thinking the same old way.
And that's something we see in the decision-making bias document, right? Avoiding that groupthink.
Oh yeah, groupthink. It's a killer.
Now, another thing MasterCard did well, they invested in those potential successors. It wasn't just about picking someone. It was about giving them the tools to actually succeed.
Setting them up for success. That's a key part of this whole fairness thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And throughout the process, they tried to stay objective, discourage that groupthink.
Keep those biases in check.
Now, the Interbrew case, it kind of shows the flip side of that, right?
Mhm.
They didn't do their due diligence. They saw dollar signs and jumped in head first.
And they paid the price.
They did. And that brings us to that document on the hidden traps of decision-making. Good intentions aren't always enough, are they?
Nope. Our brains can really trip us up. Even when we're trying to be fair and objective, it's like we're wired to make mistakes sometimes.
That's where understanding these biases comes in. Take anchoring bias, for example. We latch on to the first piece of information we get, even if it's totally wrong, and that can throw everything off.
It's like that example with the UN member countries. If you're told there are, say, 50, even if you know that's way off, your guess is probably going to be closer to 50 than it should be. Crazy, right?
Our brains are weird. And then there's the framing effect. How information is presented can totally change how we see it, even if the options are the same.
Like if you tell someone they have a 90% chance of surviving surgery versus a 10% chance of dying, they might feel very different about it.
It's all about perspective. So how do we avoid these traps, especially in the boardroom?
Well, one way is to make sure you're getting different perspectives. Don't just listen to people who agree with you.
Bring in the dissenting voices. Challenge those assumptions.
Exactly. And don't just rely on gut feeling. Look at the data, the evidence. Make decisions based on facts, not just intuition.
Speaking of good questions, this Board First Principles document, they have this great framework with 5 essential questions to ask when you're making decisions.
I like those. Wait, what? Always gets me thinking.
All right, how do we know? Why do we care? Asking those tough questions, it can really help us avoid those biases and make better choices.
It's about slowing down, taking a step back, and really thinking things through, not just jumping to conclusions.
And it's not just about the questions themselves. It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable asking those questions, even if they're challenging the status quo.
Psychological safety. That's a big one. If people don't feel safe speaking up, then you're missing out on valuable insights, and that's not fair to anyone.
That takes us back to that leadership coaching example, doesn't it? They were all about creating that relaxed, open environment.
Where people can be themselves and share their honest thoughts.
Because conflict, when it's handled well, can actually be a good thing. Can lead to more creativity, more innovation.
Exactly. It's about having those tough conversations, but in a respectful way. And ultimately, coming to a better decision because of it.
And this is where Napoleon comes in. Now, you might be thinking, what does a military dictator have to do with fair process?
Yeah, that's a bit of a head-scratcher.
Well, this book about Napoleon's leadership, it actually shows how ignoring fairness can lead to downfall.
Interesting. So even a brilliant military strategist can fall prey to this.
It seemed so. He became so focused on power and control, that he created this environment where nobody dared to disagree with him.
Ah, the classic yes men syndrome.
Exactly. And it ended up hurting him in the long run. Made him make some bad decisions because he wasn't getting that full picture, those different perspectives.
It's a good reminder that we all need people around us who are willing to challenge our thinking, no matter how successful we are.
Now let's switch gears a bit and look at how different countries are approaching this whole idea of fair process. These corporate governance fact books, they really give us a good overview of the global landscape.
So what are we seeing out there? Are there any trends?
One thing that's really clear is this increasing emphasis on board independence and diversity.
That makes sense. You need different voices, different backgrounds at the table to make sure you're considering all the angles.
And it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about making sure those diverse voices are actually heard and valued.
Creating a culture of inclusion.
Another trend is the growing focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors in investments.
So it's not just about profits anymore. Investors are starting to care about the bigger picture.
Exactly. They're realizing that fair process, sustainability, these things actually contribute to long-term value creation.
It's about doing well by doing good.
Now, thinking about that relationship between the board and the CEO, that working alliance, the SEA case study, it has some good insights there. They really emphasize that open communication, that feedback loop.
That's crucial. You need that trust, that mutual respect to make the relationship work.
The board chair, he was actually actively seeking feedback from the other directors, showing that humility and a willingness to learn.
It's about being open to different perspectives even when they're critical.
Now, this high-performance boards document, they talk about finding that balance, between exploiting your strengths and exploring new possibilities. Sort of like sticking with what you know versus trying new things.
It's a classic dilemma, right? How do you stay ahead of the curve without rocking the boat too much?
And fair processes, I think, can help us find that balance.
It's because they provide structure, consistency, which is important for stability, but you also need that flexibility to adapt, to innovate.
It's about finding that sweet spot, creating processes that are strong but not too rigid.
Processes that can evolve as the organization evolves.
And that takes constant work, evaluating, refining, being willing to change.
Fair process. It's not a destination, it's a journey.
It's funny you say that, this whole journey idea, because we have this source, 8-Pale Value New 2022, and it talks about, of all things, the weighted average cost of capital, the WACC.
Ah, yes, the WACC. I mean, it's a way to assess the risk of an investment, but it can also be kind of, misused. People use it to justify decisions that aren't really fair to everyone.
Okay, I'm not quite seeing the connection to fair process here. Walk me through it.
Sure. So sometimes, companies, they're all about maximizing shareholder value, right? So they'll go for these projects, low WACC, looks great on paper, but maybe those projects, they have some not so great social or environmental impacts.
And we're kind of turning a blind eye to the bigger picture.
Exactly. They'll say, hey, it's a good financial decision, but what about the employees, the community, the planet?
So a narrow focus on just the numbers, without thinking about the ethics, it can actually lead to decisions that, yeah, they look good financially, but they're not really fair or sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. And the Interbrew case, that's a perfect example. Remember, they were so focused on the potential profits from that Bass Brewers acquisition that they didn't really think about the risks, the impact on everyone involved.
Right. So fair process, it's not just about following the rules or making sure the numbers add up. It's about making decisions that align with your values. Taking care of all your stakeholders, not just some of them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings us to another biggie. Transparency. It's not enough to just make fair decisions. People need to understand how you got there, what the thinking was.
And we see this reflected in those corporate governance fact books, right?
Yeah.
There's a global push for more transparency in how companies are run, more disclosure, more engagement with shareholders, independent oversight of the board.
It's about accountability, giving people the information they need to hold decision-makers' feet to the fire, so to speak. And it's about creating a culture where being open is just how you do business, not something you do when you have to.
And speaking of culture, communication, it plays a huge role in building that culture of integrity, which is so essential for fair process. The Interbrew case, that was a communication breakdown waiting to happen.
Oh yeah, they really fumbled that one. Transparency builds trust. If people understand why you're doing what you're doing, they're more likely to go along with it, even if it wasn't their preferred outcome.
And it's not just about communicating after the fact. It's about being open to feedback throughout the process, listening to concerns, being willing to adjust.
That MasterCard CEO succession, they nailed that. They were super transparent every step of the way, keeping everyone in the loop, from potential candidates to the board to people outside the company.
It's a great example of how transparency can actually be a competitive advantage, not just a box to check. So as we wrap up, I keep thinking back to that idea of fair process being a journey. This final words document, it had this interesting thought about how to approach big projects. They were suggesting, make it a team effort, but with a twist. Have one team defend the project and another team try to kill it.
I love that idea. It's like building in a devil's advocate from the get-go. Forces you to really stress test your assumptions, look at all the angles.
Yeah, it's a great way to fight against groupthink and confirmation bias. You're basically creating your own system of checks and balances.
So, fair process, it's not a one-and-done thing. It takes constant attention, a willingness to question things, to keep learning and improving.
It's about building a culture where fairness is woven into the fabric of the organization. Everyone feels heard, respected, empowered. They know they can contribute.
Because at the end of the day, fairness isn't just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into fair leadership processes. Hopefully you've picked up some useful insights and ideas that you can take back to your organizations. And remember, this is a journey we're all on together. Until next time, this is Governance Matters.